Texas is another state with a panhandle, and it was going the wrong way. And then I discovered what she thought was West Virginia. Idaho. If I could make this up, I would be someplace else tonight. So if West Virginia, Idaho becomes West Virginia, then Washington is Ohio, right? And Montana is, yes, you guessed it, Pennsylvania. Okay? This little section up there, it's important. And one of the reasons it's important is you've got a road going through it, and you've got some rail lines coming through it. Okay? Now, so when the Civil War begins, those people over in Washington look at the maps and they're saying, we got to make sure we keep this. Not so much in the southern part of the state, because, but this part here, because it's east-west. That's why if you've ever been through parts of West Virginia, another little story, some of you know our daughter, Meredith, and when Meredith was she was 3 years old, we were going to a state park in southern West Virginia, and we stopped at a Burger King. You remember what Burger King has, those little, what's that called? Crown. Crown. C-R-O-W-N. Crown. So I'm giving the order, and the wait person looks down at Meredith, who's just an adorable little girl. She's now a beautiful young woman. She's getting a little older, actually. But anyhow, looks down and she said, "Little girl, would you like a crayon?" And Meredith looks up and she said, "Yes." And the woman puts a crown on Meredith's head and she starts to cry. And I pick her up, being the dad that I was, and I said, "Honey, what's wrong?" "Daddy, she said she was going to give me a crayon." I said, "No, honey. No, she was going to give you a crayon." Okay? So later in the trip, we're coming back, and we're on the West Virginia Turnpike. 2-lane turnpike. Yeah. Only in West Virginia. And we have the radio on, and they're talking about the Firestone store. You know what they sell at the Firestone store? Tars. Tars, yeah. And it's a genuine thingamajig. And our son, who's in the back, and he's 6, and we hear the voice, "Hey, Daddy." And I said, "Yes, Grant." He said, "We still in America?" And I said, "Yes, we are. In fact, we're still in West Virginia." He said, "Then why do they talk the way they do?" And I said, "How do you explain that to a 6-year-old? Okay? Why don't we talk that way? Because we go this way. How many times do you go to Charleston? I went to Charleston a couple weeks ago, first time in 10 years. Why would you go to Charleston? I mean, seriously. Now, there's probably a reason for it, but I can't think of it. Okay? So, wheeling then gets this importance because, first of all, you got all the iron here. Then you got some other things that you might not think of. You've got a hospital. You've got people who can build wagons. You're going to need a lot of wagons. Okay? So one of the kinds of wagons that we'll make in Wheeling are ambulances. Because if you've ever seen Civil War battlefields, there are lots of people who die. Remember, this Civil War, we're going to kill 620,000 of our own citizens in 4 years. That's out of a population that is smaller than the state of California today. 33 million people will kill over 600,000 of each other. Oh, they'll die of disease and other things, but if there's no war, you're not going to have that. Okay? So everybody knows that Wheeling has this strategic importance. So we've got to hold on to it. Now, why do we have a Civil War? Well, it depends on what state you're from. Our son who lives in Virginia said, "Dad, it's not called a Civil War down here. I said, oh, really? He said, no, they call it the War of Northern Aggression. I said, well, son, tell him it's the Civil War and remind him that the Yankees won. He said, you can do that. I am not. Okay? And I taught the Civil War for 39 years, and every year the North won. Every year. Okay? Now, if you're the governor of Virginia, you might not think slavery was important. Because if you're familiar with that, when he's talking about the Civil War era, he forgot to include slavery. Okay, well, he got a little history lesson. We like to sometimes avoid things that are inconvenient. And sometimes talking about slavery is inconvenient. But in 1860, we had an election, just as we had yesterday. And the election put into office a man, who was described by many as that ape from Illinois. If you think that the way we treat modern presidents is bad, you should see some of the things that were said about Abraham Lincoln in terms of his looks, in terms of his actions, in terms of his family. Okay? We've been pretty mean people for quite a long time when it comes to our political leaders. But when he's elected president, if you've ever seen an electoral map of the 1860 election, Lincoln wins all the states, with an exception here and there, from Maine to Iowa and everything north of the Ohio River and the Mason-Dixon line. He doesn't get anything to the south. Not a thing. In fact, they don't even put him on a ballot some places. He gets, out of every 1,000 votes cast, Abraham Lincoln got 398. 602 people voted for somebody else. But he's president of the United States of America. And the South, looking at that, thought, oh my goodness gracious. So in December of 1860, the South Carolina legislature voted 169 to nothing to secede from the Union. And very quickly thereafter, states like Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Florida, I know there's another wonderful one down there, Louisiana, okay? And what I used to do for my students was I would take the date of their leaving the Union and correspond it and compare it with the percentage of slave population. And what you will find is that the states that tried to get out of the Union almost leave in the order of the percentage of the slaves. In other words, the greater the percentage of slaves, the earlier they left. And one of the reasons that South Carolina was first, it had a larger percentage of its population as slaves. Now you have to understand that if you had 500,000 slaves in your state, you could count 300,000 of them for purposes of the House of Representatives. It's called the 3/5 compromise. That a slave was considered 3/5 of a person. 3/5 for people, 2/5 as property. So for years, Southern representatives in Congress really represented slaves who had no rights and, according to the Supreme Court, weren't even people. Okay? So when Lincoln becomes president, and everybody thinks Lincoln is going to do this when he may not have done that, they're getting ready to leave. Okay? Now, the key state in the South is not the heart of Dixie, Alabama, where the first Confederacy in Montgomery